Hello, I'm Donal McCauley, and welcome to this Medics Voices conversation. Today I'm talking to Mark Ebell. Mark, we know you as a very high-powered epidemiologist, but we really like to have a little bit of the backstory. Now, you've described yourself as a quite unusual American. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I was raised by German parents. I was born in Montreal and I grew up speaking German before I spoke English. And as a result of having all of my family in Germany, we traveled to Europe quite a bit. And my wife and I still enjoy going to Europe. I've spent the last about a month of the last 6 weeks in Europe, in Wales, in Copenhagen, in Croatia, Italy, and love it. My wife actually did a Fulbright in Padua, Italy. She's also an academic, totally different field. And we fell in love with that old university town in the north of Italy. And we bought a small apartment there, and we go there several times a year and absolutely love it. Trying to learn Italian, which is hard for an old brain, but we're working at it.
Now let's bring it back to medical school. Tell us about that trajectory, because you did biology first, I think.
Yeah, that's pretty typical in the US. We do 4 years of usually a science discipline. And then I did biology at Kalamazoo College. I actually have I'm not going to say which year, I think it's our 34th reunion at Kalamazoo College coming up, no, 31st. And that's coming up this weekend. It's a small school. Loved the experience there. I was really able to participate, get to know my professors, only 1,200 students. And then I went to University of Michigan for medical school and also did family medicine residency there as well. And a few years later, I also did a degree in clinical research design and statistical analysis. And that was really an important part of my research trajectory, because instead of just faking it and not really knowing what a p-value was, I learned some basic statistics, epidemiology, and I was able to apply that. I still do all of my own analyses when I do my research.
Yeah, because I mean, your primary care epidemiology is really pretty hot stuff. Tell us about the transition from the sort of family medicine to the epidemiology.
Yeah, so that was really an accident. Like so many things in our lives, it was not planned. I was a associate professor at Michigan State University. My wife got an offer of a faculty position at the University of Georgia, which was a great offer for her. So we decided we would take that. I left my position and basically went to work for myself. I was in a private practice. I was starting a software company that eventually developed the poems and essential evidence and all that. And I was working on that. And then the University of Georgia decided to start a medical school. So they hired me to help plan this new medical campus, which was a lot of fun. I love building new things and creating new things. And that was a great experience. But then when that was done, there really wasn't a research position at that new medical campus. It was purely educationally focused. So I went to the College of Public Health, and the best fit was epidemiology because they studied things like respiratory infections. And I thought, I study respiratory infections, that'll work. And so I'm not really an epidemiologist. I'm a family physician is my identity, a primary care researcher.
Now, you mentioned poems and you mentioned your software company, and that's something that's really terrific. It's a great piece of work. So just take us through step by step the evolution of this idea.
Yeah, so I was in a little practice. I was the only doctor in Madison County, Georgia, was my first position out of medical training. So I went from this really busy medical center to being the only doctor. There's 3 treatment rooms, a nurse, and me, and that was it in rural Georgia. And I'm culturally from the north of the U.S. The South can be quite different, and but I still had in the back of my mind this idea of doing academic medicine. And I signed up as a peer reviewer, and the Paul Fisher, who was the editor of the Journal of Family Practice, which was at the time a research journal, sent me an article review. And it was a study, it was an essay really about called Information Mastery. And Dave Slauson and Alan Shaughnessy had come up with this idea, a framework for how family physicians can keep current with new information and improve their practice. And he had initially rejected it. They asked him, please send it out for review. I thought it was absolutely brilliant. I loved it. Ended up getting published, fortunately. And then at the next Society of Teachers of Family Medicine meeting, I met Dave and Alan, and we schemed ways to get these poems into print, to do it on a more sustainable basis. Eventually, currently, we've been writing them for over 25 years. We write about 250 per year, and it's a wonderful effort. It's been a lot of fun. I enjoy doing it. It keeps me current, and hopefully is helpful to the folks who get it every day in their email.
So how does that work? How do you get that penetration of the community?
Yeah, a lot of, initially what we were doing and what we still do to some extent is publish a selection of the poems in medical journals. So American Family Physician has 4 poems per month. So people learn about it that way. A lot of faculty learn about it through meetings that we go to, presentations we give, obviously social media, and it's won several national awards. Dave and Alan got a national award recently for their work on poems. And yeah, it's just, I guess it's grown organically. People hear about it, and if they like it, they subscribe. So yeah, I'm not much of a marketer.
Sorry,
But
when you say subscribe, what does subscribe mean?
so it's we started this company back in, oh gosh, around 2000, and then in 2000, well, no, actually in the mid 90s, and then 2007, I want to say, Wiley Blackwell, who's a publisher, purchased it, and so they now operate it as a subscription business. So for I think $90 or $100 a year, you get the poems every day, plus you get Essential Evidence, which is an online reference really aimed at family physicians. It's written by many family physicians as well as specialists, and also the primary audience is primary care doctors.
Okay, so you've brought in this Essential Evidence Plus. You better tell us a bit about Essential Evidence Plus now.
Yeah, so that started out when I was the only doctor in this rural practice. I was really struck by how do I answer questions? I used to be able to just tap someone on the shoulder and ask them a question. And this is really early days of the internet, dial-up modems, no online references, still books on a shelf. And how do you keep up with new information? How do you make better decisions? I was in a clinic for people without insurance or with Medicaid. And so they had very little resources. And they had these brand new fancy drugs called calcium channel blockers and ACE inhibitors, right? New at the time, much more expensive. Were they any better than hydrochlorothiazide? Okay. And that was the question I had. I had a big jar of hydrochlorothiazide tablets that I could just give people. Was it better to put them on an ACE? Was it just because it's more expensive? I also noticed differences in what people were doing. For example, post-MI. At Michigan, we were taught to use beta blockers, never use calcium channel blockers. At the hospital in Athens, Georgia, the cardiologists all use calcium channel blockers, none use beta blockers. They can't both be right. They can't be singing off the same page of the hymnal. And that really made me wonder about evidence and how we make decisions, and that sort of shaped my career. So I started writing software to get back to your question while I was in the solo practice. And I would, send out discs, and I printed up a little handbook. I mean, it was very primitive. It was written up in MD Computing magazine, and eventually that became a software that was more full featured called InfoRetriever, with a little golden retriever on the logo, which I have 2 behind me here. And then eventually it got more professionalized, and when Wiley bought the company.
So we've been talking about computers and programs, but you actually wrote a real book as well. So tell us about the book.
Well, written a few. The one you might be thinking of is Handheld Computing, I think. And I wrote that with Scott Strayer. And this was in the early days when the Apple Newton had just come out. The Palm was a thing. This is early 2000s. So I've been playing around with computers for a long time. When I was 15, I took a class at the local community college, and it was punch cards on a mainframe computer. And I taught myself various other computer languages, and I still write code. I still write code for my research and also for Essential Evidence as part of my work. I enjoy that.
Well, then, with your background in evidence-based medicine and questioning the evidence, I think you wrote back in 2017, was it, that only 18% of clinical recommendations are based on high quality evidence. Do you still feel that's the case?
I think it's getting better, obviously. This was based on actually essential evidence. We have 800 chapters that are built around each one is a different disease or a different symptom, so chest pain, diabetes, hypertension. And each chapter has a set of bottom line key recommendations, and those are graded A, B, or C using the SORT taxonomy, where A is consistent patient-oriented evidence, the highest level. And so we just counted up how many A recommendations, how many B, how many C are there that we're basing our decisions on. And that was a way of trying to get at how strong the evidence is. And so I think it's gradually getting better. Certainly every year there are more and more randomized trials, more and more meta-analyses published. It's kind of nuts how many there are now. There's like 40,000 meta-analyses published. There are, in many cases, more meta-analyses on a question than there are original studies. And I think that has, the expansion of research to many other countries, the ease of doing a meta-analysis compared to the difficulty of doing a randomized controlled trial, relatively speaking, has led to what I would say, and I think some people would argue, is too many meta-analyses. We're drowning in them. And what we really need is more, basically original research and clinical trial evidence.
So when you're asked by a family physician in a rural area who's in single-handed practice, what's my best way of keeping up to date? What's your answer to him or her?
Well, it's very self-serving, of course. They subscribe to poems and get essential evidence. But I think there's some things that I've learned in other countries. So I know in Ireland, I did a Fulbright in Dublin at RCSI with Tom Fahey, who I'm sure you probably know. And I know folks at UC Dublin. Susan Smith is at Trinity now, I think. And when I was there, I learned about these learning circles. I guess so. Irish GPs often will get together in a small group on a regular basis and have a learning circle. I was just in Copenhagen talking about using poems in Denmark as a way to do continuing education, and they do the same thing. And I've always thought that's a really great idea because you get a group of peers, you become comfortable, you're okay exposing your lack of knowledge on a topic as you get to know folks better and trust them. And that's when you can learn, when you're open to learning new things. So I think that's a really good example, and I hope other countries can emulate that. I think we don't do it here in the States, not on any formal national or structural basis, but I think that's something that would be good. I think you really need two things. You need a way of being alerted to new information. So that's what the poems do. Talking to a physician yesterday, and she said, yeah, I read a poem about antibiotics for community-acquired pneumonia, and I read another one about diltiazem with the direct oral anticoagulants increasing bleeding. And at the time I read those, I didn't use them. Okay, I just filed it away. And then a month or two later, I had a patient with pneumonia, and I started thinking about that network meta-analysis. I had a patient who came in bleeding on diltiazem and Eliquis, which is the brand name we use for one of those DOACs here. And she said, I remembered those studies, and I was able to go back, stop the medication, because I now knew that was probably part of this patient's problem. So you need a way to be alerted, and then you need to be able to find that information in those 2 or 3 minutes that you have at the point of care to access the information. So I think you need both of those tools. That's a framework that Dave and Alan came up with that they call information mastery. And there are other good sources of these alerting services. There's a Journal Watch from the New England Journal. I think they do a pretty good job. They're more focused on adult medicine. They don't do as much in the way of OB-GYN or pediatrics like we do, but that's also a good alerting service. There's several out there. The main thing is that they are independent of pharma and industry. I think that's obviously something we value a lot.
What comes across is that you're really still enthusiastic and keen to impart this information. So how do you keep academically fresh? Now, you've mentioned the Fulbright. That's one example. Tell us about the Fulbright and other opportunities.
Yeah, the Fulbright's a wonderful fellowship. It's from the U.S. State Department, and my wife did one in 2018 in Padua, and that's great. I'll do one in 2019 in Ireland. And I had gotten to know Tom and some other folks at the RCSI in Dublin from various meetings. There's a meeting called the General Practice Research on Infections Network, or Grin. And I'd been going to the Grin for about 10 years, and I was usually the only American there. And it was a small meeting, 80, 90 people, folks like Paul Little, Theo Verhey, Sam Conan, it really great group of researchers. And it's my happy place to go to the Grin meeting each year. I was just in Wales last month at that meeting. And in going there, I got to know Tom. We talked about some ideas for projects. We both have an interest in clinical prediction rules. And so we built several projects around that and meta-analysis. I also did a study looking at aspirin for primary prevention because my office was next to a pharmacologist who was interested in that. So it was a really wonderful experience. And obviously living in Dublin's a great thing for a few months. I was very fortunate. But I've spent time as a visiting professor in Würzburg, in Göttingen, in Zagreb, in other countries, and I've always enjoyed that experience.
Let me ask you about another academic component, which is very, very topical at the moment, and that is your recent paper on Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the new monoclonal antibodies were in particular being quite heavily promoted. And what first caught our attention was that the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, convened an advisory panel, and they had, I think, 9 people on it. And the advisory panel voted 8 against and 1 abstention, and no one supported the approval of the drug. And they said, "Oh, thank you for your service." And then they approved the drug anyway. And when the next drug in that category came up, they didn't even bother to convene the advisory panel again. And this just seemed very fishy to us. We started looking at the studies, and really our focus was on looking at what's called the minimal clinically important difference, or MCID. And we have these scales. So you have an 80-point scale for Alzheimer's, the ADAS-Cog scale, 80 points. How many points does someone have to improve before they notice it or their caregiver notices it? And it turns out it's typically in the range of 8 to 10%. So maybe a 6 or 7 point difference on an 80-point scale might be noticeable. But these drugs were improving on the scales by 1 or 2 points, far beneath that MCID, far less than a patient or their caregiver would typically notice, even after 2 years of treatment. And so also they were causing some significant harms. People were dying because of these medications, and the company knew it. And in many cases, people would have seizures. They would have swelling or bleeding in the brain that was clinically causing symptoms. There was also a need for regular MRIs to monitor for these things. The drugs are insanely expensive, $30,000, $40,000 a year. And so it's a combination of very little benefit, significant harms, high cost, high inconvenience. What's not to like? So we decided to do a meta-analysis of all of the studies of all of the drugs, whether they were approved or not. And it was a very consistent story for each drug. Very little benefit. None of them came close to exceeding that MCID, and all of them had significant harms.
Well, that's certainly the academic controversy of the current moment, and that almost brings us up to date academically. But tell us a little bit about the Curtis Hames Award.
Oh, that was a lovely surprise. So the Curtis Hames was a physician in Georgia who I think it was back in the 1940s and 50s. I may have the decade wrong, but it was a while ago, before my time. And he was a general practitioner in rural Georgia, and he did research. He wanted to do research on the patients in his practice, and he did cardiovascular prevention research. So he drew blood samples. He had a fridge in his basement where he kept them. He did work on cardiovascular risk factors. And so he was really a model. He was probably the first general practice researcher in the United States. And so this award is for lifetime achievement in research. It's given by the Society of Teachers of Family Medicine, and I was really honored to receive it this spring in LA.
Well, before people think that you're just a one-track academic, my final question is to ask you a little bit about what you do for relaxation, because I think we've a shared interest in physical activity.
Yeah, I love to bike. I'll be going for a bike. The temperature is getting up to about 58 degrees, which is I think about 9 degrees Celsius here. And I'm up in Michigan. We have a home on Lake Michigan, and I'm up here in Michigan to enjoy the fall color. So I'm going to go for a nice long bike ride. My wife and I love to bike in Europe when we're in Europe, and I'll be going on a tour with some friends in the Netherlands in the spring. So I love doing that. I also am very nerdy. I enjoy building airplanes and models. And so I'm sitting here. I've got my setup here. I'm working on a Hawker Hart biplane right now. And that's something I picked up about 10 or 15 years ago after having abandoned it as a child, and still find it very relaxing. So yeah, like to get outside.
Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for sharing your academic world, your leisure world, your background, and indeed your life. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
Thanks so much. I've enjoyed talking to you. Thank you.